weekly news briefings with my colleague Sunita Sorachi. Until now, no one had fully detailed or mapped who gets deported in the United States. We often hear numbers from administrations eager to prove how tough they are on enforcing immigration laws. But what really determines who gets targeted? Three scholars at UCLA Center for Immigration Law and Policy and the $1 Million Hoods Project have spent years gathering and analyzing deportation data, producing maps and visualizations that trace policies back to 1895. Their work unmasks patterns of deportation that explains where we are today and why. The researchers behind Mapping Deportations, that's the name of the website, and you have it in your chat, will join us for a special briefing designed to give journalists and their audiences critical context on the roots and realities of U.S. deportation policy. Reporters, I know you came prepared with questions. Please start placing them in the chat. And this is our panel. Kelly Lytle Hernández. She's the Thomas E. Lifka Endowed Chair in History at UCLA and founding director of $1 Million Hoods. Mariah Saw, G.I.S. specialist at the $1 Million Hoods, but she prefers to be called a rebel cartographer. And Ahilan Arulanantham, faculty co-director at the Center for Immigration Law and Policy at the UCLA School of Law. We ask reporters to enter questions in the chat. We will address as many as we can after all the speakers present. So this format will be a little bit different today than other weeks. We'll have all the panelists present, and you can just place your questions there and we'll take them up. We ask speakers to speak at a moderate pace for simultaneous interpreters in Mandarin, Spanish, and Korean. And so we welcome the first speaker, Kelly Lytle Hernández, and she will present now. Hi, Kelly, welcome.
Hi, Pilar. Thank you so much. It is really good to be here with all of you and to see at least all of your names and some of your faces. And I look forward to the questions that you're going to put into the chat and to the conversation we're about to have. So I'm going to kick us off with a short description story of where this website, this project came from. And then I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Mariah, who's going to take us a little bit more deeply into the website, and my colleague, Ahilan, who's going to explain a little bit more about how it works. So this website has actually been 5 years in the making. It's not something we just came up with this summer amid the escalation of U.S. immigration law enforcement. And for me, this project came from a set of lectures I was giving back in around 2019 on the 3 forced migrations that made modern America by unpeopling the country or the land. So the first forced migration, of course, is the expulsion of native nations. The second forced migration is the transatlantic slave trade. And the third forced migration is mass deportation. And when I was going around the country giving these lectures, I had 2 really valuable resources that I could use to visualize this story for people who wanted to learn more about the history. Claudio Sant is a historian who's created a map called The Invasion of America, which shows the removal of native nations through wars and treaties over the course of the 19th century so that the United States could create the landmass that we now know to be the literal bedrock of the United States as a republic. And there's also another map called the Transatlantic Slave Trade in 2 Minutes, which shows the more than 12 million Africans who were forcibly kidnapped and removed from their homes and brought to the Americas through the slave trade. And I was able to show these videos when I was telling this story. But there was never a video about mass deportation. And I knew as a historian that there had been more than 50 million deportation orders in US history, which is a mind-boggling number. But no one had really scraped the data and created a dynamic map showing over time the patterns of deportation. So I was curious to see if we could build that. At that time, I was running a big data project called Million Dollar Hoods, which maps the fiscal and human costs of mass incarceration. Our lead cartographer is Mariah at Million Dollar Hoods. At Million Dollar Hoods. And so I went to Mariah and I said, do you think we could build a map of mass deportation from the United States? And Mariah, in classic Mariah form, got excited and was like, I think we can do it. So I handed this project off to Mariah, and Mariah grabbed it and ran with it. And I'm going to hand off the chatting now to Mariah as well.
Set up my screen here. But once you go into the website, the very first thing you'll see is the missing map. So this is a map of every single deportation order from 1895 to 2022. What's the pattern? There have been well over 8 million deportation orders since 1895, and as we know, that number is increasing every day. The pattern is that over 96% of deportation orders have been issued to people from predominantly non-white countries. And this isn't random. It's a reflection of policies steeped in racism. And the quotes of lawmakers and leaders throughout history reveal even more. What work did deportations do? What is deportation defending? In the last 127 years, who is it that has been deported? So the map starts in 1895, which is the earliest year that we have deportation order data by country or region. And each dot represents deportation orders. So the larger the dot, the larger the number of deportation orders. And we use the term deportation order because it refers to the event rather than a unique individual. So this map was built with publicly available data from federal authorities that map immigration statistics. You may have noticed that there's a racing bar chart in the corner. The overall map is grouped into 9 geographic regions, and that's just because the data over 120 years varies in how it's collected. Some years are more specific than others, so we kept the broad regional categories for consistency. But the bar chart on the side shows all the specificity. It shows the top 5 most deportation orders for each year using the original categories by federal authorities. So you'll notice that prior to 1934, authorities used race or peoples. After that, it was country of nationality, and every once in a while, country of destination. So this is a map that I recommend you view more than once. Speed it up, slow it down, rewind, pause, do it again. As you view the map, you might have questions. Write them down. What did you notice? What surprises you? Did you notice that Mexico or Mexican has been the leading with the highest number of deportation orders continuously since 1916? Why is that? How is deportation a tool for racial banishment? And what else is needed to understand the story? Deportation, after all, is just one tactic of forced removal. There are also so-called voluntary departures, exclusions, and more recently, Title 42 expulsion orders. So that is our feature map that kicks off the website. And I'll pass it to my colleague Ahilan to talk a little bit more about how it started with a map but grew into something much bigger.
Thank you so much, Mariah. And she will have, I know, more visualizations to show from the website, but that one, I think every time I watch that, it really hits me because my background primarily is as a litigator. Most of what I do, have done my whole career, really, about 25 years, is litigation in federal court challenging the federal government's immigration policies on behalf of immigrants and immigrants' rights organizations. And for the last 4 years now, I've also taught at UCLA and co-directed the Center for Immigration Law and Policy. And I'll tell you how I got involved in this website, but I have to say the overwhelming impression I get from watching Mariah's map is that the laws and policies and rules and procedures change all the time. And that's what the lawyers are so interested in. They're changing every 7 minutes. Like now I'm constantly having to deal with them. But it's amazing how constant the effect of deportation, the actual deportations, is over time. As Mariah said, since 1916, it's overwhelmingly the Mexico was the single highest number, and obviously Central Americans also huge through most of that time as well. So I, as an attorney working in the Center for Immigration Law and Policy, got into this project in a somewhat different way, starting actually after 2020, with the protests around the murder of George Floyd, and 2021. I and others at the Center for Immigration Law and Policy had been litigating race discrimination cases against the federal government involving immigration policy. Some of those I'm sure will be very familiar to you, the Muslim ban, and then of course the litigation over temporary protected status, which is something I'm still very heavily involved now, for over 1 million people, a lot of them from Venezuela and Haiti, but Central American countries and other countries as well. And I was struck by how stark some of the race discrimination was in immigration policy, even during the Biden administration. So, just to give one example, the application of the Title 42 program, excluding people from the country on the basis of COVID, was applied very harshly to Haitians and to other people from Central America. And then just like that, virtually all Ukrainians were exempt from the program, and they were allowed to come in. And similarly, the Biden administration was defending the illegal reentry, the criminal prohibition on illegal reentry, even after Kelly and others working in the field, federal public defenders from San Diego among them, had uncovered that law was motivated by race discrimination. It was passed in 1929 at the height of the eugenic movement and its role in immigration policy. There's a very clear law that the government is not allowed to enforce laws that are motivated by race discrimination. And yet the Biden administration was defending these. So of course, we continue to litigate and to advocate with the administration and at state and local levels as well. But we wanted to develop a website that would trace the racist origins of so many immigration laws and policies that remain in effect today. And that's really how we got into it. And then, just because we're all at UCLA and I knew Kelly from other work and, our MacArthur connection and various things, she and Mariah showed us an early version of this map. And we realized that actually our interest in trying to develop an educational tool that would illustrate in a more honest way a lot of the history of immigration law and policy, and their interest in developing this map really could merge well together and combine to tell a rich contextual story that has not been told as much as it should have been in the past. Before I hand back to Kelly, I just want to say we will answer questions, including this very good question, important question about Mexico. Isn't it obvious that there should be Mexicans who are, being deported because Mexico is right next door? And we have many, many thoughts on that question. So just hold on, and I promise we will give you an answer to it.
Yes, and do not let us escape that. We don't want to escape it. So if I forget to come back to that, please put it back in the chat. So I'm going to pick up here and talk about, the broader website a little bit. So when we created the map, it became very clear that to be able to interpret the data on the map, you needed to know the context, additional factors, what's at play in these numbers. So we went and we built out the website with some historical summaries and a timeline that provide that context. So some of the things you would need to know to understand the deportation data is, at what point are there certain laws that target certain communities for exclusion or removal? what are the various enforcement priorities over time, and how do those change? All of that affects who actually is getting apprehended and removed from the country. So our historical summaries and our timeline try to provide the world in which this data is being created. So our historical timeline is organized into 5 major eras. The first era is 1790 to 1875, and we call it the roots of U.S. immigration control. And during this era, we lay out that in the antebellum period, the period of slavery prior to the Civil War, that the U.S. immigration system really was created to establish and to sustain the United States as a white man's republic. As this section details, it's amid the expulsion of Native nations that Congress and states begin to pass laws that target free Black migrants for exclusion from the country. So in fact, the very first immigration ban that Congress ever adopts is the 1803 Immigration Act, which targets, and I quote, Negro, free persons of color for exclusion from any state where they're banned from entering. The idea at this point in time in 1803 was that if free Blacks entered a slave state, their very presence would incite or inspire rebellion among the enslaved. So any free Black was banned from entry. But in particular, this is during the period of the Haitian Revolution. And so enslavers across the southern United States were particularly frightened that Haitians would arrive into their state and incite revolution or rebellion. And in fact, Ahilan, I don't know if we've talked about this, but Southern slavers talked about Black emancipation as a moral contagion. And so they're saying that they really don't want Haitians to bring the moral contagion of Black emancipation into the United States. So there's this constant thread of public health, right, and race being mixed up together. So these first immigration laws targeted free Black migrants. And at this point, states are really running the immigration system because enslavers don't want the federal government and emancipationists or abolitionists in particular to be able to control questions about who's allowed to enter the country. So that's era 1. Era 2 is called the whites only immigration regime. It runs from 1876 to 1929. And it documents how after the Civil War, when the federal government took its now familiar control over the immigration system, white nationalists began to push Congress toward excluding, punishing, and deporting as many non-white immigrants as possible. By 1929, Congress had barred almost all Asian immigration to the country in explicit and implicit ways. Congress had blocked most free Black migration into the United States and criminalized large numbers of Mexican immigrants entering the country. So we dubbed this the whites only immigration system. And I want to talk about this for just a moment, because I know this can be a little hard to accept. I don't use the whites only system as a literal term, and that's because it's never been literal. If you think about the period of Jim Crow in the United States, there were whites only signs on like restaurant windows, at doors to schools, in the beginning of some neighborhoods would tell certain populations to stay away or that they were whites only areas. But the purpose and the effect of these signs was rarely to stop all Black and non-white immigration or movement into a building or an area. Back doors and side gates always remained open to Black and non-white workers, janitors, nannies, laundresses, landscapers, and whatnot were all still allowed to enter those buildings and those areas, but in a subordinated position. So Jim Crow was less about the separation of the races, and it was more about the rules and the rituals of white supremacy. And so by dubbing the immigration system, the US immigration system, as a whites only system, what I'm trying to suggest is not that all non-white immigrants were kept out of the country, but really that the US immigration system is a system of racialized power, rooted in the rules and the rituals determined to who's allowed to enter the country on what terms, and who could be kicked out and under what terms. So in this period, we talk about the creation of this whites-only immigration regime. It's about the rules of who can enter and who cannot, but it's also about the construction of a new form of federal power and how it applies to immigrants. The third era is called Consolidate and Carry Forward, which talk about how during the Cold War, Congress amended the whites-only immigration system, but did not abolish it. The fourth era is called Amend and Enforce, which is 1955 to 1990. And we talk, importantly, during this period, it's often presumed that in 1965, during the Civil Rights Movement, Congress abolished racism in the US immigration system. However, what we point out here is that, number one, the 1965 Immigration Reform Act only abolished racism in one specific corner of the immigration system and left racism intact in the rest of the system. And following the 1965 Immigration Act, Congress adopted more laws and Supreme Court passed new rulings that legitimated racism in the immigration system. And here I'll speak very briefly about the Brignone-Ponce decision from the Supreme Court in 1975, which said it's legitimate to use race as a factor of immigration law enforcement. This is the ruling that the Supreme Court effectively held up a couple of weeks ago when it allowed ICE and Customs and Border Patrol to continue using race as a factor in their operations here in Los Angeles and elsewhere in the Ninth Circuit. So then finally, era 5, we call Deportation Nation. It goes from 1991 to the present. And we argue that since 1991, the United States federal government has built the largest immigrant detention and deportation system in the world, conducting more than 7 million deportations during this time period, issuing more than 25 million so-called voluntary departure orders during this time period. And in fact, the racial disparities in deportation grow during this time period. They get worse. This growth is largely due to the tightening relationship between the US criminal legal system and the immigration system, really effectively making mass deportation a component of mass incarceration. So these are the 5 eras that we talk about in general. And in sum, what we're trying to show is how racism was baked into the immigration system over time, dating all the way back to the antebellum period, and is yet to be fully purged, and in fact has been reinvented in some ways since 1965. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to my colleague Mariah again, who's going to show us more of the visualizations on the website.
Right, I'm not sure if you're trying to speak now, but if so,
I
you're
just thought that thank you. So we have a maps and data page on the site, and we have our main visual, but we also have 15 visuals total. So each timeline has a feature visualization that goes along with the summaries and the timelines. And then we also have some additional data that helps, tell some of the other stories about the other enforcement tactics that are used that point at other contexts and dimensions that are helpful to tell this story. So I'll go through a couple of examples really quick just to give you an idea of what's here. So like I mentioned, we have our feature map, but we also have, actually, let's see. Deportations by year. So if you're really interested in that racing bar chart on the side and you want to know the details for each year, this is the visualization that you want to go to. So initially, it's the summary of 1895 to 2022. It's interactive. You can zoom in and out, see the specificities within the regional groupings. And then you can also use the drop-down menu on the side to look up specific years. And you can see how things change over time, how they shift. You can see how the categories at some point are race and peoples, and then how it shifts to countries. And then further down, it shows the same data set, but in a single aerial chart. And you can see that the racial disparity grows over time. It's also interactive, so you can turn different regional categories on and off to just get a better sense or focus in on one group. Another one we have is beyond deportation, because deportation is just one tactic that's used for forced removal. And so all of these different types of tactics are the ways that they're recorded by federal authorities. We have a data methodology page that explains what all of these specifically mean. It's in the sources page. And this is also interactive. And the important thing to point out here is different tactics take up the bulk of the enforcement during different time periods. And voluntary departures overall is the most common type of enforcement. We also have the Creating the White Man's Republic, and this is just a screenshot of the final aspect, but it's an animated map that shows indigenous removal in the expansion of US territory at the same time that all of these states and territories are enacting those bans on Black migration. So showing that relationship between indigenous removal and Black exclusion. This is a map that's the feature visualization for the second time period that shows how the whites-only immigration regime is developed. So a key part of this map is typically you have a compass that shows you the directions, tells you how to navigate a map. And the compass on this are 4 questions. So if you start at the top, upside down, it says, how does America first create a distorted view of the world? Then on the side, who is racialized and how, who is criminalized, who is banned, barred, and capped. And so these are the guiding critical questions to navigate not just this particular map, but the website as a whole. So this is predominantly a lot of different quotes from lawmakers, a couple of statistical elements here, and the different policies that are all woven together. Here's some examples of some of the other ones. A deeper look looks into some more immigration data for the early period. We have one specifically looking at Black immigration and specifically how net migration was negative for a number of years post 1924. We have a data set called Hidden Data that looks into uncovering indigenous data erasure in deportation data sets. Another preview of some of the additional visualizations that we have, the different tactics, the relationship between mass incarceration and mass deportation, and an entire collection of the quotes from lawmakers throughout time. And so this one is just an example of what this looks like. Again, it's interactive. You click on the dots from the different time periods and different quotes will come up. And then we also have an updated version of the whites-only immigration regime, reflecting how the themes and sentiments established early on are continuing today, asking the question, is the system broken or is it functioning as designed? So it's the same concept with the same 4 guiding questions, but with looking at the parallels in present day. And then lastly, there's a map called a Futureware, which is the one at the very last part of the home page. And this map is different than all of the other ones in that it's not documenting injustices and harms, but it's playing with breaking those patterns. It's asking the question, what would it look like if we reverse the patterns of our history? So it's the same exact data as our feature map, but it's played in reverse. And so it's a map about where is it that we're going to, and it's dedicated to all of those who have fought for and continue to fight for immigrant rights. And I'll pass it back to Ahilan.
So in addition to the visualizations that Mariah was just walking us through and the historical summaries of the time periods, which are in the website that Kelly just described, there's also a timeline that corresponds to each period. And if you click into the timeline, I'm going to show you these in a second. If you click into the timeline, there's a number of discrete events that are described there. And those were created, it's obviously not every important event in the history of immigration law, but we thought they would be very useful as a way to explain the maps in a little bit more detail, because you can get a look at particular events and incidents that happened, court decisions, new laws, major policies that have an effect on driving, the patterns that we see in the maps. And I was really excited to show all of these to you today, particularly to this audience, because what I would love to see is reporters drawing historical connections, drawing the historical connections between things in the past and things in the present when they're writing about the stories, for things that are happening right now. And so I want to show you a few which give an example, because in a couple of spots in the website, we actually highlighted those particular historical connections. I'm going to do that if I can manage to make my screen share work. Wish me luck, everyone.
Good luck, Ahilan.
All right, is it working? Are you looking at a spot on the website?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So if you start on the website and you go to the timeline, click on a particular year and then go down, you can click on certain things like Operation Wetback, which is this obviously, many of you probably know this, but in the summer of 1954, it was a mass deportation campaign that I think Kelly studied it in great detail. We can say it looks a little bit like what we're seeing right now in Los Angeles and elsewhere. And so we have a box there that actually draws that connection explicitly. And I should say, it's not like we drew every connection. You could do that for like almost every entry in this timeline. But there's a number of them like this. And so we talk about the connection between what happened in 1954 and what's happening now in the summer of 2025. Similarly, let's see if this works. Yeah. So if you go down and look in the 1991 to now, you can see, if you want to know more about TPS, there's the Temporary Protected Status Program and the attempt to end it. And we describe actually first the attempt to end it that began in 2018. I was very involved in that. I was counsel for the groups that were litigating against the Trump administration's attempt to end TPS in 2018. And then fast forward to now, and we know this is happening again with respect to Venezuelans and Haitians, and now people from 5 other countries: Honduras, Nicaragua, Nepal, Cameroon, Afghanistan. And so again, we're trying to draw those connections so that when people write about this, they say, hey, this isn't a new thing. They tried to do this just, 7 years ago. Here's another one, which I think is also relevant to another question, that's the question about Mexico that somebody asked. So I don't know how many of the people in this audience would know what the registry is, the registry provision. Yeah, Pilar knows. Here, let me click on this. So that's first enacted in 1929. So if you go in the timeline, 1929, go past the summaries that Kelly was talking about, and go down to the bottom, you can see we have the Registry Act. And I'll stop a second here just because it helps to answer the question. Somebody asked, like, isn't it obvious that you'd have more deportations to Mexico because Mexico is right here, and there's all these people here from Mexico? And I think what I find sort of insufficient about that as an explanation for our maps is it fails to account for the ways in which the law itself has made it much easier for some people to come and for some people to remain than for others to come and remain. And the registry is a perfect example of this. The registry provision is a rolling amnesty. That's what it is. And the provision just says, and it's still in the immigration law to this day. And what it says is, if somebody has been in the country unlawfully since a certain date, and they're still here now, as long as they're not otherwise inadmissible, like having been convicted of a disqualifying crime or something, they can just pay a fine. And if they pay the fine, then they can adjust their status. And this was introduced in 1929, at the same time when there was a huge wave of white supremacist ideology driving immigration policy in the 20s, which is what produced the period that Kelly was talking about when they banned virtually all immigration from Asia and Africa, right? The same time, they passed this amazing progressive rolling amnesty in 1929. Like, how did those two things happen at the same time? Well, it was because it primarily benefited Europeans and Canadians. 80% of the people who qualified in the first decade were from those parts of the world, and that continued actually in the decades that followed. This statute was updated. They passed new ones. The first one said if you were here in 1921, you could adjust your status. Well, then there was another one that, updated that date. I can't remember what the dates are now, to the 1940s, another one, 1960s. And the last time it was updated, and you can see this in the fast forward to now, was in 1986, when it was updated to 1972. So any person who's been in the United States since January 1st of 1972, which is not a lot of people anymore who still have not adjusted their status. But if you're undocumented and you've been in the US since January 1st, 1972, you have amnesty. You can just legalize. You just have to register. So the question is, like, why did that not get updated after that? And then there's a reason, right? I mean, and this has a lot to do with the fact, which, the effect of that law now, if you pass that law now and updated it now, it would legalize, obviously, millions of people from Mexico and Central America. And that's just one example. It is much easier to adjust your status if you have overstayed your visa than if you have entered without inspection. The law only makes it a crime to enter without inspection. It does not make it a crime to overstay your visa. That's really weird. Why is that? Is one normatively more problematic than the other? Well, one answer to that question is the law that punishes entry without inspection was passed in 1925. I mean, in 1924, right? No, 1929. Sorry, 1929. Kelly's always teaching me, even now. So it's a law that's passed to punish Mexicans. You could have passed a similar law that would have punished a whole load of Europeans, but they didn't. Quite the opposite. They made it easy for those people to legalize. And these are not even old. They're true even to this day. Look at the laws now governing the treatment of Ukrainians and the parole programs for the Biden administration, which allowed Ukrainians to come here. More than 500,000 Ukrainians came, including many on the parole program. But the comparable programs for Afghans were incredibly harsh, and almost nobody could come in. For Haiti, for a long time, there was no such comparable program. They were deporting Haitians en masse at the same time they were allowing Ukrainians to enter. And to be clear, I have no problem with that. Like, I'm very happy that Ukrainians can come into the country. But my point is that there's obvious racial discrimination, even now, that's driving who gets to come in and also who gets deported. And that was even before we had the white South African refugee program, which, allowed them to jump the line over so many refugees from other countries. So that's one of them. The last one I'll show with respect to these slides is somebody asked a question about strategies of resistance. And I wanted to highlight that our website is a little bit of this already, and we want to do more. But there are, of course, people from the beginning who have resisted these unjust deportation policies, including Chinese people who led a whole lot of the litigation in the 1870s and others. And we highlight those from time to time in the timeline of the website. So here's one of them that I picked because I'm figuring a lot of people don't know about this. Carlson v. Landon, which is a case from the Red Scare era in 1952, is actually the case that gave the government the power to jail immigrants because they are dangerous. That's the first case that said immigration detention on the basis of dangerousness is permissible and is constitutional. But what a lot of people don't know, I mean, a lot of people don't even study that case. Even if you study immigration law, you won't necessarily study it. But a lot of people don't know there was a remarkable man among the plaintiffs in that case named David Hyun, who was originally from Korea, but he was a Chinese citizen. He'd been in the US since he was 7 years old, lived in Hawaii, then in California. He was in the Reserve Officer Training Corps and the Army Corps of Engineer. But nonetheless, the government said that he was affiliated with the Communist Party, and on that basis deemed him dangerous. And in Carlson v. Landon, his detention was actually upheld. The court had held that they could detain him. And so, we tell a snippet of that story. There are other ones like this that are also in the website that I think are interesting and worth taking a look as you go through. Just quickly, I wanted to come back to one other thing. Mariah mentioned that there's a quote map, right? And talked a little bit about this. And this is something that's very interested in right now. We have a lot more work to do in trying to fill this out. We gathered a lot of quotes from the ones that we had, but there's certainly more to be had. You can look on this thing and you can see from the time periods where particular quotes have happened. And so this one is from 2018. It's Donald Trump saying, "Why are we having people from shithole countries coming here?" That was a quote that he made in a meeting, which was about a proposal, a bipartisan proposal that would have protected people with temporary protected status by giving them lawful permanent residence, including a lot of Haitians and a lot of Salvadorans, as well as people from Sudan and Honduras and Nicaragua. And Trump rejected that bipartisan proposal, and this is what he said when he rejected it. And that was part of the basis for litigation that I and others brought at that time to protect the TPS community. And it was successful back then. But now, they've done it again, and we're in the midst of that litigation now. And at least so far, well, actually, that's what I wanted to talk about. So, these here are not yet in the website, but I hope they will be at some point. The Trump administration said very similar things this time when they were going after Venezuelans, because there's a lot of Venezuelans, 600,000 of them who are protected by temporary protected status. And here we put in front of the court, this actually is a slide of quotes that I gathered from an exhibit that we filed in the court, trying to show the connections, the historical connections between the things that people said in the 1920s and earlier and the things they're saying right now. So this idea that the blood of our country will be poisoned by like morally contagious and deficient people, riffraff and scum from other countries, is an idea that is all over the 1920s in immigration policy, people talking about it. This is just one example. Well, in 2023, President Trump started repeating this crazy lie that Venezuela had emptied its prisons and mental health institutions to send those people into the United States. It's totally bizarre. And he started saying it again and again and again. And they said it to Venezuela and it's to other countries. It was also connected to another lie. They were repeating that Haitians are eating the dogs and cats of people, which is totally debunked claim. People actually went to Venezuela and looked at prison population data. We cited this in our court case to disprove this claim. It's preposterous. There is no massive dip in prison populations or mental health institutions in Venezuela. And then Trump made it explicit. Very explicit. He said, they are poisoning the blood of our country. Well, when Kristi Noem, who's the DHS secretary, ended the TPS program, she went on national news the next day on a TV show, and she gave this explanation for it. She said the TPP program, she meant TPS program, has been abused. And she said, and remember, Venezuela purposely emptied out their prisons, emptied out their mental health facilities, and sent them to the United States. So we are ending that extension of that program. So the reason she gave on national TV was to repeat this racist lie. Right? So we went to court and we challenged this on a number of grounds, but this was one of the grounds, prominent ground. Sorry, moment.
We have a lot of questions, Ahilan. Will we?
Okay, yeah, I'm almost done. I'll close up with this to say, we won a very strong court decision on the subject, and our judge, the judge in the district court, said, this is the classic example of racism. He said, generalizing on the basis of a negative group stereotype is the classic example of racism. And when he did that, he cited back to the cases condemning the Japanese American mass incarceration, including the dissent from Korematsu, which said that the government had fallen into the ugly abyss of racism by operating on an erroneous assumption of racial guilt. And this decision, extraordinary decision, well-reasoned, 78 pages, was stayed in a 2-paragraph order of the Supreme Court, which allowed the TPS termination for Venezuela to go into effect. And I say that just to say, I think it's so important that everyone in the educational context, in the media context, all over, talk about these historical connections, because the Supreme Court anyway doesn't want to hear it. And I think it's really important if we want to break out of the cycles of the past. This is one of the ways in which we're going to have to do it, is by telling a more honest account of our history. So I'll stop there. I have a list of at least some of the questions. I don't know how you want to do it, Pilar.
I'm gonna try to go and try to make the answers short so we can go through as many as we can. I
Sure.
just want to start from the top. Question from June Nukum from Philippine News Today. Are the choices or biases on deportation in the US based purely on whims, or are there any logical legal basis?
I mean, if we want a very quick answer, I would say is like they're usually based on a legal basis, not always, but at least what we're trying to interrogate is like why are those laws the way they are? And I think those laws reflect the underlying racism of the immigration policy and the project that Kelly was talking about. I don't know if you guys have anything you want to add to that.
Okay. From Lilia Galindo, can the US realistically be a white nation again? That's an intriguing question.
I'll take this one. I mean, the United States has never been a white nation, right? And so the concept of the whites only immigration policy isn't whether or not we are ever have been a white nation. It's about the rules are put into place to subordinate non-white groups that are within the country. So of course, enslavement, removal, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, repatriation are all many examples from US history in which non-white folks are here, but systems have been created to create subordination. So no, the country will never be a white nation by demographics. But the question is, are we still a white man's republic by its political infrastructure? That we can have a conversation about.
Yeah. I'm going to call my colleague, Sunita. I think you have more than one question. Sunita, can you summarize quickly what you're asking?
I think one of the most significant questions I wanted to ask was both Reagan and Bush provided amnesty in 1986 and I believe 1992 as well. Am I incorrect on that?
Correct on 86. You're correct on 86. There's a massive, the last large legislative amnesty is in 1986. And to answer your question, there's a small dip right after that. It's not huge, but there is. And then what you do see that I think is significant is, and particularly a dip in Mexico, I should say, right? There's a small dip in Mexico, and it seems to be like holding there. And you have to look for a few years because it takes a while for the amnesty to be implemented, and there's a bunch of litigation over it. But what you see is starting in the early 90s, so after that time period is kind of expired, you see an increase. And then you see a massive increase after 1996, which is when the federal immigration law becomes far more punitive.
Increase in what? Deportations? Migration?
Deportations to Mexico and all deportations, both. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sunita. Pamela, looking at your research, it's clear deportation has never been just about enforcing the law. In this moment, with ICE raids creating fear in immigrant communities, what lessons should journalists take to avoid repeating government narratives that disguise bias as neutrality? Great question. Anyone can take that?
And for me, just talk about the historical context. A place that there was a related question about Vietnamese and Chinese. You can look and see the exact number of Vietnamese deportations by year, Chinese deportations by year. Same for voluntary departures. It's all there in those big round circles if you show by year. So yes, that's my main thing is like talk about the historical connection between what's happening now, what's happening in the past. I don't know if Kelly or Mariah, you have other things you want to say.
I really appreciated that question up front about isn't deportation just a reflection of the fact that it's Mexicans who are entering? That's a sort of a mantra that's out there. If you can help us take apart that really faulty analysis of the data, that would be incredibly helpful, and do it, as Ahilan is suggesting, by citing the history, by citing the contextual factors that lead to the deportation numbers.
There's a question here in the chat. Can you explain the main challenges you faced in bringing this project to life? I'm sure there were more than one.
It took us 5 years. That's all I can say. I mean, Mariah had to scrape from individual annual reports all of the data, and then to figure out a way to visualize it. If she actually visualized what's happening without making any adjustments, the bubble to Mexico literally like breaks the map. It gets so big. So she had to make some adjustments so you could still see the world.
The log scale transformation, what year is it, Mariah?
It's across the whole map. And the reason why it's so large is when it gets to the highest point, which I think is 2013. And that eclipses basically the whole map if you don't do a log transformation across the whole data set.
We also
More questions?
cut many timeline entries as we wrote, because we were just trying to narrow, and we didn't want to tell just a whole history of immigration law, but really to try and tie them to the map, and that was also took a long time. Yeah, good.
Got it. I'm going through questions quickly so I can get to more of them. Are there currently any federal threats affecting the work that you're doing? Do you fear any censorship of the work that you're doing since the president considers research like yours contrary to his MAGA policies?
Well, we launched a couple days ago, so let's see.
We'll see.
But no.
Okay, yeah. That can be said about so many of us. Can you please explain the impact of U.S. imperialism on immigration?
Well, I'll say this, that historically speaking, immigrants tend to go to places that there are relationships with already in terms of their either family or their nation state. So imperialism, whether it's US imperialism or British imperialism, tends to create pathways of migration. So people don't show up as communities randomly. So the fact that the United States is penetrating into Asia through war after World War II, and penetrating into Central America in the throughout the 20th century, but certainly in the 1970s and 80s, those are the pathways that get opened for migration. So that's a general response to imperialism.
The situation is escalating to levels now nobody expected. Well, maybe. Maybe some people expected it. Based on historical learning, in what ways can we expect the situation to worsen? What maps can we see, I don't know, like 10 years from now? Is it going to be significantly changed or?
Two things. I'm watching for prosecutions of citizens and legal residents for harboring the undocumented. And I'm watching for what's happening in the world of immigration control beyond US territory. A lot of US immigration control happens beyond our borders. It's called the externalization of the border. And we haven't been reporting on that very much yet, but I suspect that there's quite a bit of activity out there.
Meaning what, visas? Like, I don't know, like the
Sure.
Department of State?
Yeah, visa enforcement, traveler sanctions, but also US collaborations around border enforcement around the world. The idea is to stop immigrants long before they arrive at a US-Mexico border or port of entry.
Another question, very powerful graphics. Does your data provide context on the status of the deportees? What was their legal status in terms of visas, undocumented, and were there US citizens among them? Well, there probably were, right?
It doesn't provide status information. But yeah, go ahead, Mariah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. What was?
That's all. I was going to say it doesn't provide status information.
Yeah, exactly. There's for a really short period of time, there's like reasons for being either debarred from entry, which is also called exclusion, or deportation. But those are really early on. It's inconsistent and a status is not reflected.
Okay, from Araceli Martinez, apart from Mexico and Central America, which other countries see the most deportations? And is there a trend to fewer deportations to predominantly white countries?
Mariah, do you want to take that?
I mean, it changes a little bit different during different time periods. Like there's definitely the trend of Mexico and Central America throughout. Different parts of South America more recently have started to rise, and then different parts of Asia as well. And then the Caribbean has also been a consistent target. And you'll see this in both the voluntary departures and in the deportations, and also in the expulsion data. Like no matter what enforcement tactic you're looking at, that's pretty consistent. And then just some of those numbers will kind of go here and there. It helps to turn the filters on and off. You can kind of see how that moves a little bit more clearly.
This relates also to a proportionality question, which was asked earlier. There's many, many, many more admissions from Europe than, for example, from the Caribbean. But deportations historically, overall, between Europe and the Caribbean are pretty close. The same is true of Africa. So that I think is also another way of understanding the sort of racial impact of the deportation policy, even outside of the Mexico, Central America context.
Okay, Veronica Wood, when you use terms like deportation, expulsion, or voluntary departure, how exactly are you defining them in your data? And do these definitions leave, I'm sorry, this is like a lot for me.
Like
Yeah,
systemic forces.
yeah, for systemic forces like indigenous communities have often faced.
Right.
So those definitions are the definitions of the tactics that federal authorities are using. And so if you look in the data methodology, it defines specifically like what processes those are you referring to. And I think something that's important to remember is even with all of those data sets, there's dynamics about forced removal that are missing and not counted. There's all sorts of other ways that there's informal types of removal. I know Kelly had talked about an example before, and with indigenous removal, those are things that haven't been quantified in kind of a similar way. So it's I think even still with that vast amount of numbers, there's all of these other dimensions that aren't captured.
Do you have data specifically on Asian immigrants, especially for Chinese? Well,
Yeah,
I think,
country level. You can click and look exactly Chinese deportations by year. It'll give you that.
yeah, and those like round things that you were showing. During the period of the internment of people of Japanese descent, what made a difference on who was detained versus deported?
Well, American citizens of Japanese descent were detained en masse, but not deported. There were a smaller number of Japanese non-citizens who were detained as alien enemies as well. I'm not sure about whether Japan was accepting deportations during this period. So I don't know whether they were deported or not. And they were not. Is that right, Kelly? And then also all along the West Coast, that there were Japanese people or Japanese descent people living like up and down the Western coast outside the United States, like in South America, who were also detained and in some cases actually transported to the US and detained in the US.
The question from Christopher Young at Mississippi Link newspaper. Mississippi is known as the largest incarcerator in the world. Is this just a freakish outcome of the last state to let go of their Confederate State of American moniker, or a more deeply ingrained component of racial banishment? Kelly?
Sorry, I was looking for the question. I think I missed its details, but it was about mass incarceration, as I recall. I don't know if I have an answer to that. I mean, you can look at all different kinds of data points. Oklahoma often has the highest rate of incarceration. Mississippi might have highest numbers, all that. These are all legacies of enslavement and removal, with Black and Indigenous folks facing the highest rates of incarceration across the country.
I'll just add Louisiana has the highest number of immigration detention centers now, which is striking given how small it is. And we have a visualization which shows the connection of mass incarceration and deportation. It's amazing. It's like they go exactly almost in lockstep. And you can find that on the visualizations page.
And the South has the most 287G agreements.
Which are like,
we have 1 minute to go, and we have still so many questions. Okay, does the data contain information about deportations that were based on ideological grounds? Anarchists, communists, other subversives? No? Okay. You couldn't do it all.
not
All right. Not yet. Do you have a breakdown on ethnic groups who are deported from the US and the main reasons for their deportation? Where can this information be seen?
just the center of the country information, that's what we have. There's a map, one of the maps that Mariah did, which shows just sort of points to this hidden data problem, like how many people are indigenous, but are just described as Mexican or Salvadoran or Guatemalan. There's a map that kind of tries to get at that a little bit and sort of interrogates that problem. But beyond that, we have no separate marker. A long time ago, ethnicity was used for a period. So early in that racing bar chart, you can see it's ethnicities rather than nationalities that are being coded. But then that drops off when, Mariah? 1930 something?
1934, I think, or thereabouts.
Okay, we're out of time. One more question. What is the difference between the mass deportations during the Trump administration and those of previous administrations?
I would say that for me, as a historian, what is happening now is simply an escalation, what was of a system that's already been pre-built and in place. There's nothing phenomenally new to all of this. He hasn't invented much. He is, pulling the levers that were already built.
So there are more questions. I could just say, guys, if you feel your question hasn't been answered, you can email it to me, for example, or to Sandy or to whoever, and I can send it to the scholars and maybe ask for them to answer because our time is up. Thank you so much. This has been so fascinating, especially for those of us who are immigration history nerds, and appreciate your work, everything that you've done to get us here.